This is your crash course on environmental justice. There's one example of environmental racism that I learned about way back in college over a decade ago that really stuck with me. It was the 1987 report called Toxic Waste and Race in the United States that showed that communities of color and low-income communities were disproportionately hosting hazardous waste sites. We're talking polluting industries, landfills, factory farms that cause the neighboring communities to have health problems that are associated to the air and water pollution. They also have to put up with the nuisance of the smell and noise from these industries. It was shocking for me to learn that communities of color were disproportionately hosting these unwanted toxic sites. I also learned about Indigenous people facing environmental injustice. In the 1800s, the US government had buffalo populations killed off to try to destroy the livelihood of the Plains tribe. And to this day, the Standing Rock Sioux are protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline to protect the Missouri River, which is a main source of water for them. Historically, environmentalism was more of an elitist movement in the States. Environmentalism had been about protecting the things that the upper and middle class communities cared about, like a nice wilderness preservation area to enjoy. And if there was a massive landfill that was being proposed for development in their backyard, then they had the Not in My Backyard movement to make sure that no unwanted projects were taking place in their communities. But looking at the issue through an environmental justice lens, you'd say, I don't want this landfill in anyone's backyard. I don't want this project to be kicked over to some more vulnerable community that doesn't have the means to fight big corporations. So that's when the Not in Anyone's Backyard movement started, when people realized that environmental racism was going on in the country. But the 20-year report of the 1987 Toxic Waste and Race study showed that if anything, injustices have gotten worse, not better. Mainstream environmentalism still doesn't consider the environmental justice issue. There's a lot of work to be done, and you can't promote environmental solutions without considering environmental justice. In order to be aware of the environmental issues that are affecting people in different parts of the world, in different income classes, in different communities, I encourage you to diversify the places that you get your news from. It helps broaden your understanding of how environmental issues are affecting people in different countries and in different parts of your own home country. In some countries, the climate crisis is affecting people now. In some countries, Indigenous communities are having their land stolen now. In some US cities, there are dump sites right now that are poisoning the air of the most vulnerable communities. There's Cancer Alley in Louisiana that's full of industrial plants and an extremely high rate of cancer among those living by these plants. With increasing heat waves around the world, the elderly and children are at risk of death. In 2003, the European heat wave killed about 15,000 people in France, mostly elderly folks who don't always have that feeling of thirst. And in the States, the cost of AC in scorching summers can be prohibitive for low-income communities. So, hearing a diversity of stories like this is important, and unfortunately the media tends to drown out most of the voices that are the most affected by environmental issues. So there are many different ways to stay informed and make sure that you're getting the full picture of the climate crisis. Of course, reading international news is always helpful. I suggest following major environmental groups like Earth Justice, IPCC, EcoWatch, Indigenous Rising, Climate Reality, This is Zero Hour, UN Climate Change, CNN Climate, 350, Climate Justice Alliance, various Extinction Rebellion groups. And to take it further, follow environmental activists from around the world. I feel like I'm sort of cheating. I speak 5 languages, but I personally follow environmental activist friends from France, Switzerland, the DRC, Central and South America, the US, the UK, Canada, Belgium, and Germany. And if language is a barrier, I suggest following English-speaking activists from around the world. I'll leave a non-exhaustive list of young environmentalists that you can follow in your workbook. The list includes folks like Vanessa Nakate, Isra Hirsi, Varshini Prakash, Jamie Margolin, Jerome Foster II, Kevin J. Patel, and Nadia Nazar. With environmental justice comes a just transition. What is a just transition? The concept is to phase out polluting industries that harm workers, the health of communities, and the planet, and to offer opportunities for workers to transition to other jobs. This framework was developed by environmental justice groups and labor unions with important leadership by low-income communities of color. A just transition is about moving from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy in a just and equitable way, where past harms are rectified and reparations are made by creating new relationships of power. The Green New Deal proposes to tackle climate change by making the US carbon neutral, and doing so through a fair and just transition for communities and workers by providing high-wage jobs and addressing the historic discrimination of vulnerable communities. So to learn more about what a just transition should look like, check out the Climate Justice Alliance. Another aspect of environmental justice is doing some digging to determine whether your purchases are supporting environmental injustices abroad or in your own country. American chemical companies have been guilty of exporting pesticides that were banned in the States, that they were forbidden to sell to Americans. And meanwhile, citizens of developing countries were buying the US's forbidden products because their government environmental standards were far weaker than those in the States. And that also meant that workers in developing countries who were working in fields with toxic US chemicals were not trained to protect themselves with masks or the appropriate gear. So these workers would become very sick and sometimes die. And in some cases, the food treated with these toxic chemicals abroad would be sent back to the States for US consumers to eat. So as a consumer, you want to inform yourself as best you can to not support such environmental injustice. Even with products made and sold in the States, I see a great injustice. In the cosmetics industry, for instance, companies aren't fully transparent about their ingredients, and most ingredients are not tested for safety prior to be sold on the market. And as a result, millions of consumers are putting dangerous products on their bodies. But worse, people in middle to upper class communities are more likely to have the time to learn about these toxic chemicals and opt out and opt for something that's sometimes a more expensive alternative. But instead of leaving it up to the consumer to educate themselves on the potential toxicity of ingredients, the laws in the States should be tightened, like they have been in Europe, so that everyone is kept safe from carcinogens, neurotoxins, hormone disruptors, and other toxic chemicals. This is why I greatly support the work of groups like the Environmental Working Group that pushes for consumers to have the right to know what's in their products. Another environmental justice concern is environmental migrants. The impacts of climate change don't affect everyone equally. Western countries bear the highest responsibility when it comes to emissions of greenhouse gases that have worsened the climate crisis, and yet they'll be the less affected by the climate breakdown due to the geographical location that they're in and the infrastructure that they have. Usually it's those with the smallest carbon footprints who suffer the greatest impacts of climate change. The world's poorest countries have contributed less than 1% of greenhouse gas emissions, but are the most vulnerable to the climate crisis. Those in the global south are at a much higher risk of overheating, of extreme weather events, and food and water insecurity, and these sorts of stressful environmental conditions lead to migration. Environmental migrants or environmental refugees are people who are forced to leave their home because of either a sudden or long-term change to their local environments, be it from droughts, desertification, sea level rise, or weather pattern disruption. Climate refugees are those that specifically leave due to sea level rise, extreme weather events, or water scarcity. And to be clear, these migrants don't always leave their own country. Sometimes they migrate within their own country. Already in 1990, the IPCC noted that the greatest single impact of climate change might be on human migration, with millions of people displaced by shoreline erosion, coastal flooding, and agricultural disruption. According to a report from the Environmental Justice Foundation, tens of millions of people could be displaced due to climate change within the next decade. And a World Bank report from March 2018 states that over 140 million people could be forced to leave their homes in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia. The report states that with concerted action, including global efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions and robust development planning at the country level, then this worst-case scenario of over 140 million could be dramatically reduced by as much as 80%, or more than 100 million people. A new ruling just passed on January 20th, 2020 by the UNHCR, stating that refugees fleeing immediate danger due to the effects of climate change cannot be forced to return home by their adoptive countries. This is a big step forward for environmental justice, considering that the burden of the climate crisis falls most heavily on the global south, when Western countries are responsible for most of the damage. The last subtopic of environmental justice I want to bring up is the repression of environmental activists. Being an environmental activist can be dangerous. My former partner in Ecuador, he was working on stopping mining exploration activities and preventing mining in his neighborhood in the Intag region of Ecuador. The primary forests there are part of two of the world's richest biotic regions. The ecosystems play a crucial role in protecting headwater watersheds and provide essential habitat for dozens of species facing extinction. And the threat of mining to this region has been going on since at least the 1990s, and community opposition has always been strong, so much so that they've made several mining companies flee. But being an activist in the resistance is not easy. I remember my former partner fearing for his life after receiving death threats. Opponents to the projects have also faced long-term imprisonment for having tried to stop the project, despite it being carried out illegally with no community consultation. So depending on where you're protesting or who you're up against, government repression and violence in general is a reality. In 15 years, the number of environmental activist murders has doubled. Between 2002 and 2017, 1,558 environmental defenders were killed. When I was working at the World Wildlife Fund on the campaign to protect Virunga National Park, I remember how dangerous it was to be a park guard there. In 2018, 6 park rangers were killed, and another in 2019, and it's heartbreaking. And the murders are not only of people who are employed to protect natural areas, these are people protecting their actual homes. On January 10th, 2020 in Nepal, a 24-year-old was murdered while trying to stop the illegal extraction of riverbed materials right outside his home. And in the Amazon, armed miners are attacking and murdering indigenous community leaders. Journalists are also being murdered for reporting on environmental injustices. There is no sustainable transition without environmental justice.